The wind howled across the Montana plains like a living thing, bitter and merciless, carrying ice crystals that stung any exposed skin. Kelly Morrison pulled his coat tighter as he made his way from the barn back to the main house, his breath forming white clouds in the December air. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in the last hour, and the weather report warned of the worst blizzard to hit the region in 15 years. He was halfway across the yard when he heard it, a sound so faint he almost missed it beneath the wind's roar. Kelly stopped, turning his head to listen. There it was again, a desperate, plaintive braying that sent a chill down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Kelly changed direction, following the sound toward the tree line at the edge of his property. His ranch stretched across 200 acres of rough country, and in weather like this, lost livestock could mean death within hours. But as he drew closer, he realized the sound wasn't coming from cattle or horses. These were donkeys, and they weren't his. Through the swirling snow, 3 shapes materialized near his fence line. Kelly quickened his pace, his boots crunching through the crusted snow. 3 donkeys stood huddled together, their gray coats frosted white with ice and snow. They were shaking violently, their heads lowered against the wind. But it wasn't just the animals that stopped Kelly in his tracks. Each donkey wore some kind of pack, carefully secured to their backs with weathered canvas and rope. The straps looked professionally tied, not hastily thrown together, and strangest of all, each animal had a small bell attached to their halters that jingled softly as they moved. "Easy now," Kelly called out, approaching slowly with his hands visible. The donkey's ears swiveled toward him, but they were too exhausted and cold to startle. The largest of the 3, a genet with kind eyes, took a tentative step toward him and brayed again, this time with what sounded like relief. Kelly quickly assessed the situation. These animals were in bad shape, hypothermic, exhausted, and clearly lost. Whatever they were carrying would have to wait. Right now, he needed to get them to shelter. "Come on, friends," he murmured, gently taking hold of the lead donkey's halter. To his surprise, she followed willingly, and the other 2 fell in line behind her. They knew humans, trusted them. These weren't wild animals or neglected strays. Someone had cared for these donkeys, trained them well. So where was their owner? Kelly led them to his barn, a sturdy structure that had weathered decades of Montana winters. Inside, the air was warmer, thick with the smell of hay and horses. His 2-quarter horses, Sage and Copper, nickered curiously from their stalls as the strange procession entered. He settled the donkeys into empty stalls, quickly removing their frost-covered packs and setting them aside. The animals' coats were soaked through, and he could feel them trembling under his hands. Kelly worked efficiently, rubbing them down with dry towels, checking their hooves for ice and injury, and providing fresh water and hay. Years of ranching had taught him how to care for animals in distress, and these 3 were in desperate need. As the donkeys began to eat, some of the panic in their eyes fading, Kelly finally turned his attention to the packs he'd removed. There were 3 canvas bundles, each carefully wrapped and secured. His hands were clumsy with cold as he untied the first one. Inside was a wooden box, aged and weathered. Kelly opened it carefully, half expecting emergency supplies or camping gear. Instead, he found himself looking at dozens of envelopes, all addressed in neat, careful handwriting. He picked one up, turning it over in his hands. It was addressed to Sarah Martinez, Mercy General Hospital, Denver, Colorado. Confused, Kelly opened the second pack. More letters, these in a different box, addressed to various locations across 3 states. The third pack held something different, a leather journal, well worn, along with more letters, and what appeared to be a very old Bible with gilt-edged pages. Kelly carried everything to his workshop area at the back of the barn, where he kept a small heater and a workbench. He turned on the heat and sat down, opening the journal with careful hands. The first page bore an inscription in shaky handwriting: "The Christmas Letters of Thomas Brennan, December 2025. If found, please ensure delivery. Time is running out." Kelly's throat tightened as he began to read. Thomas Brennan, it turned out, was 87 years old and lived in a cabin 40 miles north of Kelly's ranch, deep in the mountains. The journal entries explained everything in a rambling but heartfelt narrative. Thomas had been a mailman for 42 years, serving remote communities across Montana. He'd retired 20 years ago, but he'd never forgotten the faces of the people on his route, especially the ones who rarely got mail, who waited by their windows for his arrival because it meant someone in the world was thinking of them. "I'm dying." One entry read, "The doctor says maybe 3 months, probably less. Cancer, the aggressive kind. I've made my peace with it. I've had a good long life, better than I deserved, but I have one thing left to do." Thomas explained that for 60 years, since he was a young man, he'd been writing Christmas letters to people who needed them. Not just any people, people he'd encountered who seemed alone, forgotten, or in need of hope. Some were former residents of his mail route who'd moved away. Some were people he'd met only once but never forgot. Some were the children and grandchildren of people he'd known, addresses he'd tracked down over the years. "I write to remind them that someone remembers," Thomas had written, "that they mattered enough to be thought of. In a world that moves so fast, sometimes we all need to know that someone, somewhere, is thinking of us." But this year, Thomas was too weak to make the deliveries himself, and he didn't trust the postal service for something so personal, so important. That's where the donkeys came in. Kelly read on, fascinated and moved. Thomas had raised donkeys for years: Molly, Jeb, and Clementine. He'd trained them to carry packs, to walk long distances, to follow routes he'd carefully planned. His original plan had been to send them with his neighbor's grandson, a young man who could walk the routes with the animals and ensure the letters were delivered personally to each recipient. But the blizzard had come early, and the young man had been stranded in town. Thomas, growing weaker by the day and terrified his final Christmas letters wouldn't reach their destinations, had made a desperate choice. He'd loaded up the donkeys, tied bells to their halters so they'd be noticed, and written detailed instructions in the journal, praying someone would find them and help. "Each letter is numbered and addressed," Thomas had written. "I've included money for gas and supplies in the Bible, $20,000, everything I have left. I'm not asking for charity. I'm hiring whoever finds this. Please, if you have any kindness in your heart, help me complete this final delivery. These letters are my last gift to people who made my life meaningful. They don't know I'm dying. They don't know these will be the last words I ever write to them, but they'll know someone cared, and at Christmas, maybe that's the only miracle some of us get." Kelly sat back, running a hand over his face. The wind rattled the barn walls, and outside the blizzard was reaching its full fury. He looked at the 3 donkeys, now warm and fed, resting peacefully in their stalls. Then he looked at the stacks of letters, maybe 200 in all, addressed to people across Montana, Wyoming, and Colorado. This was insane. He had a ranch to run, animals to care for, and his own family coming for Christmas in just 10 days. He should call the authorities, let them handle it. But even as the thought crossed his mind, Kelly knew he wouldn't. Something about Thomas Brennan's words had reached into his chest and grabbed hold of his heart. Kelly opened the Bible and found the money, just as Thomas had promised, along with a detailed map showing the delivery route, broken down into manageable segments. Thomas had thought of everything. Over the next 2 days, as the blizzard raged, Kelly read every single letter. Thomas hadn't sealed them, and he'd written in his journal that he hoped whoever found them would read them, would understand the importance of the mission. Each letter was different, personal, filled with memories and encouragement. Some were funny, recalling shared moments from years ago. Some were touching, offering comfort for losses Thomas had learned about through his careful attention to obituaries and community news. All of them radiated genuine love and care. One letter was to a woman named Margaret Chen, reminding her of the time 50 years ago when she'd given young mailman Thomas a cup of hot coffee during a snowstorm, and how that simple kindness had stayed with him his entire life. Another was to a boy named Daniel Reeves, now a man in his 30s, whose father had been on Thomas's route. "Your dad was proud of you," Thomas had written. "He showed me your report cards, your baseball trophies, everything. He died before he could see the man you've become, but I've kept track. You're a teacher now, just like he hoped. He'd be so proud." When the storm finally broke, Kelly made his decision. He called his wife, Jessica, and explained the situation. She was quiet for a long moment, then said, "That's the man I married. When do we leave?" They planned the route carefully. The 3 donkeys had recovered fully, and Kelly learned they were indeed well trained, capable of traveling 15 miles a day with their packs. He would drive ahead with most of the letters, delivering them personally to each address, while Jessica filmed the journey and helped navigate. The donkeys would come along in the horse trailer and at certain stops, the ones Thomas had specially marked in his journal. They would complete the deliveries on foot with the donkeys, just as Thomas had envisioned. The journey took 8 days, 8 days of driving through snow, packed roads, of knocking on doors and handing letters to confused, then moved recipients. 8 days of watching faces light up with wonder and tears as they read Thomas's words. Kelly met Sarah Martinez at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. She wept as she read how Thomas remembered her mother, who'd been one of his regular customers 40 years ago, and how he wanted Sarah to know her mother had always spoken of her with pride. He found Daniel Reeves at the elementary school where he taught, and watched the man's hands shake as he learned that someone had been carrying his father's pride all these years, keeping it safe until it could be delivered. In a small town in Wyoming, they delivered a letter to an elderly woman named Rose Patterson, who lived alone in a retirement home. Thomas had written about a conversation they'd had 30 years ago about her dreams of seeing the ocean. He'd enclosed a photograph he'd taken on a trip to California, just so she could see it through his eyes. Rose held the letter to her chest and told Kelly it was the only Christmas card she'd received in 5 years. At each stop, Kelly explained about Thomas, about his illness, about his final wish. Some people wanted to write back, and Kelly promised to deliver their replies. Others sent gifts, homemade cookies, preserved jam, small crafts, tokens of gratitude for a man they'd never expected to hear from again. On the 7th day, they made the deliveries Thomas had marked for the donkeys. In a remote mountain community, they walked 3 miles with Molly, Jeb, and Clementine to reach a family Thomas had known decades ago. The grown children of his former customers stood in the snow, marveling at the donkeys, at the letters, at the sheer improbability and beauty of the gesture. On the 8th day, Christmas Eve, Kelly and Jessica drove to Thomas Brennan's cabin with the donkeys and a bundle of reply letters from the recipients. The cabin was small but well kept, smoke rising from the chimney. A young woman answered the door, Thomas's hospice nurse. "He's been asking about the donkeys," she said quietly. "He wakes up every hour asking if anyone's found them." Thomas was in a hospital bed in the cabin's main room, shrunken and pale but alert. His eyes widened when he saw Kelly, then filled with tears when Kelly told him every letter had been delivered. Every single one, Kelly confirmed, pulling up the chair beside the bed, and people sent these back for you. For the next hour, Kelly and Jessica sat with Thomas, reading him the reply letters, showing him photographs Jessica had taken of the recipients. Thomas wept and laughed, his thin hands clutching the letters like precious treasures. The donkeys, he whispered, safe and sound in your barn. Kelly assured him, they're heroes, Thomas, they saved your mission. Thomas smiled, a peaceful expression settling over his weathered face. I knew someone would find them. I prayed for someone with a good heart. He reached out and gripped Kelly's hand with surprising strength. Thank you for being that person. They stayed through the evening, helping Thomas's nurse, making sure the old man was comfortable. As midnight approached, mocking Christmas, Thomas asked Kelly to read one more letter, the only one that hadn't been in the packs. It was addressed to Kelly Morrison, though it had been written before Thomas even knew his name. To whoever finds my donkeys and helps them complete their journey, it began. Thank you. You could have turned away, called the authorities, decided it wasn't your problem, but you didn't. You chose kindness. You chose to honor an old man's dying wish. That makes you remarkable. In a world that often feels short on compassion, you've reminded me that good people still exist. Whoever you are, wherever you're from, I want you to know that your kindness matters. It rippled out from my cabin to 200 different hearts, and each of those hearts will carry that kindness forward. You've created more good in this world than you'll ever fully know. Merry Christmas, friend, and thank you for making an old man's final Christmas the most meaningful one of his life. Kelly couldn't read the last paragraph through his tears. Jessica took the letter and finished it for him. Thomas Brennan died peacefully 3 days after Christmas, surrounded by letters and photographs, knowing his mission was complete. In his will, he left his cabin and remaining possessions to Kelly and Jessica, along with the 3 donkeys and a note that simply said, for the man who understood. Kelly and Jessica kept the donkeys, and every Christmas thereafter, they loaded them up with letters, their own tradition now, inspired by Thomas. They wrote to lonely people in their community, to veterans, to nursing home residents, to anyone who might need a reminder that they were remembered, that they mattered. The story of Thomas Brennan's Christmas letters spread through the communities he'd touched. Newspapers picked it up, then television stations. The story resonated with people who felt forgotten in an increasingly disconnected world. But for Kelly Morrison, standing in his barn on a cold winter night, brushing down 3 donkeys who'd changed his life, it wasn't about the attention or the acclaim. It was about the simple truth Thomas had understood, that remembering someone, truly remembering them, and taking the time to tell them so, was perhaps the greatest gift one person could give another. And sometimes that gift arrived on the backs of 3 half-frozen donkeys, carried through a blizzard by the sheer force of one old man's love and one stranger's willingness to help. As Kelly locked up the barn that night, Molly brayed softly, and the bells on the donkey's halters chimed in the quiet air. He smiled, touching each animal's neck affectionately. "Good night, friends," he whispered. "Thank you for finding me." And in that moment, Kelly understood what the donkeys had really been carrying that frozen night, when he'd found them at his fence line. It wasn't just letters or money, or an old man's final wish. They'd been carrying something far more precious and far more powerful. The unshakable belief that kindness still exists in the world, and that sometimes all it takes is one person willing to open the door when someone or something comes calling in from the cold. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.